Okay, so now this is lesson 12 of Bible Geography 2, and next week we will have a review for our final exam. Lord willing, next semester will be a class that will focus on the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, the whole semester, just in the Gospels, the geography of the Gospels. So we will move very slowly through our Holman book next semester, because I only think they have a couple of chapters for that, but there's a lot more than what's in the book. So that's what we'll do next semester in the Bible geography class. Don't ask me about the other class yet. It's a mystery, even to me. So I don't know. Okay, so this evening we're on page 22 in our notes, and we just want to review what we said about the kings of Persia, because here is the Persian period, the rise of Persia, and the first king that was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah, his name was Cyrus. And he is prominent in Scripture as this anointed shepherd of God, prophesied by Isaiah 150 years before his birth. And then in Ezra, in chapter 1, if you turn to the book of Ezra, we see that he is referenced in the book of Ezra as the first king of Persia, and then the king who commissioned the return of God's people out of captivity to go back to the land. The Lord stirred up his spirit, it says in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. It was God behind even the kingdoms of the world. And let me just say, generally speaking, that separation of church and state, which is a deep Baptist principle, has nothing to do with Christians' involvement in government or interest in government. God is interested in government. God is interested in the political movements of the world. It is God who is the king of every human king. Amen. And so separation of church and state does not mean a disinterest or a disinvolvement of Christians from the political process, if I could just say that. The Bible has a lot to say about politics and about governments and rulers. So here it says, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. God is interested in politics, sounds like to me, as I read my Bible. Okay, so here we have Cyrus. He's the first of the Persian kings that we want to know. Now, the second of the Persian kings, if you look in your book, I found a mistake in our Holman Bible Atlas. I found a mistake. Okay, it's on page number 166. Because I was a little confused last week, and I even had to, for the first time, I had to delete a section of our class from the online, because I was like, I don't want my confusion to be so apparent, to the world, to all 25 people who are going to watch this video. But nevertheless,
including a monk in Egypt.
That's right. Oh yeah. First I was like, what are you talking about? So, what is wrong? Cambyses the second. You see where it says there? And what does it say in the biblical connections? He's not mentioned in the Bible. That is wrong, I believe. Because here we have in the book of Ezra, so we have Cyrus commissioning the return of the people. Then in chapter 3, the foundation is laid. In chapter 4, look at verse number 5 of Ezra chapter 4 and verse 5. It says, they hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even unto the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Verse 6, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So this chapter goes on to explain that between Cyrus, look at your chart, and between Darius, there was a successful attempt to thwart the work from being built, and it was stopped. And the king here in verse 6 is called Ahasuerus. Now, when we read Ahasuerus, who do we think of?
Esther.
But it can't be him. It can't be the king during the time of Esther, because look at your chart.
Yes.
He's much later. He's after Darius. So this is a stoppage of the building of the temple between Cyrus and Darius. Who is the king between Cyrus and Darius? Cambyses. So when it says he's not mentioned in the Bible, well, the name Cambyses is not mentioned in the Bible. But I believe this Ahasuerus, and so you might want to put in the little chart of your book, because I'm sure you'll refer to these charts and to this book for the rest of your life, at least once a month as you're studying in your Old Testament. But you might want to put Ezra chapter 4, verse 6. Now you say, well, why is Ahasuerus there? Well, Ahasuerus is a Babylonian name for the Persian kings, much like Pharaoh would be an Egyptian name for the Egyptian kings. So Ahasuerus was the Babylonian name for a Persian king. And so now verse 6 says, Ahasuerus, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Then verse 7, to confuse us even more, look what it says. It says, and in the days of who? Artaxerxes wrote Bishlam, Mithridates, and these guys, and to Artaxerxes, and then Artaxerxes is referenced here by name, going down in the text, like in verse 8, to Artaxerxes the king, also down in verse 23. Verse 23, now when the copy of the king Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and these other guys, it says they made haste, and then they made the work to what? In verse 24, they made the work to what? I'm in Ezra chapter 4, verse 24. The work, it what? It ceased. The work ceased during this reign of Artaxerxes. And then in chapter 5, God raises up who? To preach, and the building, the rebuilding is begun once again. Haggai and Zechariah. And clearly, Haggai and Zechariah are said to preach during the second year of Darius. So we're still up to Darius here. So now the question is, I believe Ahasuerus, as I mentioned in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, is Cambyses. So, but who is this Artaxerxes? Those are the questions your teacher has to try to figure out. I don't know if you care, but I have to care. Okay, so what my understanding of this, there's two possibilities of who this Artaxerxes is. One, like I mentioned, Ahasuerus, that is a Babylonian name for the Persian kings. Artaxerxes is the Persian name for the Persian kings. So it's the Persian name for the Persian kings. So even if you look in your chart, there's more than one Artaxerxes on the chart. There's Artaxerxes 1, there's Artaxerxes 3. So this Artaxerxes could be another name for Ahasuerus. It could be the same person. So the king Ahasuerus of verse 6 could be Artaxerxes of verse 7. Or, and you could Google if you like, there was another Persian king for a very brief period of time. His name was Smerdis. I'll spell it for you. Smerdis. You don't actually have to know this. This is just, I was interested in it, you know? Smerdis. So it could be Smerdis. He is also a Persian king. Not on our chart. The chart has another mistake. It doesn't, if Smerdis, he was a Persian king actually in history, but he was so brief, maybe the chart didn't even, the author didn't feel to put him in. But this could be Smerdis, or it could be Cambyses. Okay, so I wanted to clear that up first. And then where I got confused last week was in Ezra chapter 6, verse 14. Do you remember my confusion? Where I was saying what an incredible verse this is, how it has so much historical accuracy, and it does. It's incredibly, it's a huge miracle. We have such an ancient text that has such precise historical accuracy, references to individuals, places, and so forth. And as well in the order of history, it's accurate. Ezra chapter 6, verse 14, it says, and the elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, according to the commandment of Cyrus. Okay, so Cyrus, he was the first king that issued the proclamation for the rebuilding to begin. But then between Cyrus and Darius, the work stopped. So then he says, and Darius and Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. So the question here is, who is this Artaxerxes? And it kind of confused me last week, because Artaxerxes, at least in our notes here, is going to commission Ezra and Nehemiah much later. So in this context, and that's later on, that's in chapter 7, verse 1. So in Ezra 7, verse 1, it says, now after these things in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia. This is a different, it could be the same Artaxerxes, but it could be a different Artaxerxes. Okay, let me just put it that way. So it's a bit confusing. It is a bit confusing. That's why I was confused, because it's confusing. And I was like, why did he mention, if this Artaxerxes is the Artaxerxes of chapter 7, and the building of the temple had finished in chapter 6, why did he mention this Artaxerxes who appears later when the temple's already built? That's why I was somewhat, does that make sense? That's why I was confused. Why was this Artaxerxes mentioned? So again, the choices would be, he's saying that this Artaxerxes is referent. If this Artaxerxes of chapter, are you interested? Does this make sense? Okay. So the Artaxerxes of chapter 6:14 could be the Artaxerxes of chapter 7, verse 1. And maybe, Ezra's just looking back in history and saying, God used Cyrus, God used Darius, and God also used this Artaxerxes because he is the one who commissioned Ezra and Nehemiah to go back. And maybe he's just taking a kind of a bird's eye view of the whole rebuilding. So it could well be this is the Artaxerxes of chapter 7, verse 1. Or you could say, since Artaxerxes, as I said already, was often used as the general Persian title for the king, it could be that he's saying the commandment of Cyrus and Darius, even Artaxerxes, if you read it that way. I mean, that's just what I found. If you want to change the and to an even. If you don't want to do that, that's all right. Then you can say it's the Artaxerxes. But it could be a reference that Darius is the same, that Artaxerxes and Darius, same person. So that's what I figured out. I had to find it out. Because I was like, what was going on with that? All right. So I wanted to kind of clear that up. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so the kings that we do need to know, letter A was Cyrus the Great, then the fall of Babylon, 539, then letter C was Darius the first. In your notes, that's page 23, Darius the first. He was the most able administrator of the Persian kings. He organized the empire into those large regions called satrapies. And the temple was rebuilt and dedicated while he was the king of Persia, Darius. Okay.
Last week you were saying there was 120 satrapies.
Yeah, in Daniel.
The book says 20.
Where?
Oh, the book says 20 on page 167 under Darius. It's the second line. I don't know if we need to know that, but because I know Daniel said 120 princes, right?
Yeah, 120 princes. I'm trying to look. Where does it say that?
Well, Darius the first. Darius proved to be he organized the empire into 20 large regions.
Oh, 20 there. Okay, large regions called satrapies. Okay, right. All right, I'm not going to dispute that. But yeah, it does say that there were 120 different princes, which would lead me to think that there was some other, maybe another division under that 20. But okay, so Darius the first, and he was the king during that chapter in in Daniel. when Daniel was in the lion's den chapter, right? That's Daniel chapter 6, the lion's den chapter. And then Xerxes is letter D. He's also known as the Persian king. You have that, what? Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. So that's Xerxes. And then we have Artaxerxes, and he was the Persian king when Nehemiah was his cupbearer in Shushan, the palace. Okay, so with all of that, if you look at your map, page 170, and you can see that red line, you do see the route of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we also said another thing with all of this little confusion about Artaxerxes and everything else and Cambyses was Sheshbazzar. We said clearly in this class, at least, that Sheshbazzar is the same person as who? Zerubbabel. Now, if you look in your notes or look at your map here, right, like right here, it says first Sheshbazzar, then Zerubbabel led groups of Jewish exiles back to Judah. 537 would be his time when Sheshbazzar, and 522 was Zerubbabel. I crossed out 522. I think that's another mistake in our Holman Bible Atlas. I like the Holman Bible Atlas, but so because we're saying that Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel is the same person, which was 537, 536. That was that first movement of the exiles back. So down here we have the river Kibar. Who was the prophet who wrote by the river Kibar or Chibar? Who was the prophet? Bailey? Did you say it?
No.
Oh, who said it?
Ezekiel?
Ezekiel, river Kibar. You got to know that. You got to know that. Now, turn to Ezra chapter 8, verse 14. And what river was Ezra beside when he proclaimed a fast? In Ezra chapter 8 and verse number, I was just making up a verse. I really meant verse 21. Ezra chapter 8, verse 21, where he proclaimed a fast beside the river Ahava. So look at your map and find the river Ahava. I tried to find it. Guess what? Okay, it's not there. It's not there. Okay, it's not there. So again, I was like, well, then where is it? I gotta find out where's the river Ahava. So, huh?
Is that the Gulf of Akaba?
No.
River near there?
Well, so here we have this red line. Susa is where? What's Susa? We said that's the same as Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. That was Shushan. Remember where it says Nehemiah was in Shushan, the palace. Okay, so Susa so that's where Nehemiah began his journey, from Susa. But Ezra began his journey at this river Ahava, which, from what I could understand, was a river in Babylonia, here in this area, a river in Babylon. And it was probably a tributary of some kind coming off of the Euphrates River in an area, either a village or something, known as Ahava. So it was probably a part of, or it was Ahava was a river in Babylon. And if you look at your lexicon, that's what it would say, a river in Babylon. So it's very general. Named after a town or district through which it flowed, and it flowed from the Euphrates. So if you look at your Euphrates River here, the Euphrates River, and you find Babylon, this is where Ezra would have begun his journey, from the river Ahava, where they proclaimed a fast and then started to move. Okay. So so Zerubbabel came back at 536, 537, and then Ezra in 458, which is about 75 to 78 years later, something like that. And then Nehemiah, another 14 years after that. So that's where we're at. Okay? So
it's impossible that you were going back and then gotten more people?
who?
The
Oh, you mean Sheshbazzar or
Sheshbazzar, yeah, or whatever.
not the no.
Okay.
No. Even in your book, it says that it sounds like they're the same person. And he does make that point on page number 169. He says that they could be the same person. He does not believe they are. That's okay. I believe they are. I'm just letting you know.
Okay.
If you come up to a different conclusion, it's fine.
Is your
We
thinking,
can agree to disagree on things like this, you know?
is your thinking that one would be kind of like a Babylonian Persian name and one would be like a
It could be. It could be it could be like exactly just Sheshbazzar could be a title. Both were called governors, and definitely both laid the foundations of the temple. So it wouldn't make sense to me to have it. And they're both the leaders. And clearly in the prophets, Zerubbabel is the name given to the leader at that time. Okay, so let's move forward here in the Persian administration. Now we're on page 25. So Judah was a small province, was referred to as the satrapy. What? How is it referred to? Beyond the river. So what river is it beyond? That's on the bottom of page 169, that last column there. We're under the Persian administration, and it says, Darius reorganized the empire into 20 satrapies and separated beyond the river from Babylonia. And so that beyond the river is referring to the lands west of what? The Euphrates. Okay? So the lands beyond the river would be here. So Israel, Jerusalem is the land where? Beyond the river. So this expression is used a few times in your Bible. You might want to, if you please write these references down. Ezra 4:10, Ezra 4:36, Nehemiah 2:7. Okay, so let's just look at those references. Ezra 4 and verse 10. Oh, there's another interesting name in this verse. I was like, it sounds like a fish. Look at his name. Yeah, red snapper, his name. No, it's not red snapper. It says, Ezra 4:10, the rest of the nations whom the great and noble red snapper, a snapper, he was a snapper, not a perch, a snapper brought over and set in the cities of Samaria, and the rest that are on this side the river, and at such a time. So this side the river, and they're writing from where? This is a letter in this chapter. This is a letter written to the Persian king from people over here. So he's saying that this king, a snapper, brought over and set in the cities of Samaria on this side of the river. So he's talking about over here when he says this side of the river. We're on this side of the river. You're on that side of the river. So the Euphrates was like a dividing line. And a snapper, if you're interested, is probably, well, is one of the kings of, let's see, I'm sorry, I had it. Want to make sure I say this right. It's probably one of the Assyrian kings, either Shalmaneser or Esarhaddon, that brought the Jewish people out and settled them over there, and then they were brought back. Anyway, you don't have to know that. It's an Assyrian king from the past who had resettled the people. But anyway, we just want to focus on that phrase, this side the river. So that's our geographical landmark, that the Euphrates River was kind of a dividing river for the ancient world and for those living in this whole Fertile Crescent area. So that's one of the references. The other one that I said is Ezra chapter 8, verse 36. Okay, and who's got that verse? Ezra 8:36. Micah?
And they delivered the king's commissions unto the king's lieutenants and to the governors on this side of the river, and they furthered the people and the house of God.
Okay, so again, there's that phrase, this side the river. So again, why are we doing this? So that when you read your Bible, you'll be able to know there's talking about people on this side of the Euphrates River, the side of Israel's side. And then it's in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse number 7. And here's the phrase now that this is the specific phrase that the verse that the book references in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 7. Ellie, do you have that one, please? Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 7.
Yes, sir. Furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah.
Okay, so what is Nehemiah asking? Where is Nehemiah when he writes this? He is where? Still. He is in Shushan. And he's asking the king to give him safe passage. And then he says, if it please the king, let letters be given to me to the governors that are where? Beyond the river. Because once Nehemiah crosses that river, if he doesn't have authorization letters from the king, he could be raided, murdered, his goods could be stolen from him. It's a very dangerous travel. I mean, Nehemiah, the way I look at it, was kind of like Home Depot on wheels, except I don't know if they had wheels. They had a lot of caravan of camels and donkeys, but I don't know what they were pulling. But they were bringing the building supplies all the way. And so he said he needed letters to be given to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come down into Judah. So that's what he's asking for there. Okay. Now, the next little section here, and this is important, you'll have to know this, because in Nehemiah, there are three main enemies. Who are the enemies? And let's just fill the blanks, and we'll look at the verses. On page 170, who is the governor of Samaria? One of the powerful governors at the time when Nehemiah went back was Sanballat. Okay. You have the notes? No, okay. Sanballat. You get the last copy of notes with, that's a special copy, Mary Chris. It has a coffee stain on it. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's specially marked as the last one. No, the last shall be first, though. Just remember. Okay. So Sanballat, he was the governor of Samaria. And Samaria and the governors, like Sanballat, leading the rest of them, caused much trouble for the returning exiles. We'll look at the verse in a moment. Who was the Ammonite that gave Nehemiah so much trouble? If you look down, actually, it's on the next column. It's on the second column, first paragraph there. His name is Tobiah, the Ammonite. Now, and then there was an Arabian. So there was a governor, there was an Ammonite, and there was an Arabian. And his name is who? Geshem, the Arab, a powerful chieftain who controlled, and it's always about the money, isn't it? He controlled the trade routes. And so again, Israel coming back in and establishing their kingdom, it could affect their power, their monetary control over the trade routes, and so forth. So those are the three here. And you have to know that these, because they're so prominent in the book of Nehemiah. They're very prominent. So look at your map on map number 86, and you see the white boxes here. And so at the top you see Nehemiah's enemy Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, interfering with Judean efforts to rebuild. So he was in this area of Samaria, Sanballat. And then Tobiah was from Ammon over here. The wealthy Tobiah's meddled in the affairs of Judah for centuries. It's to their benefit for there to be confusion and controversy over here so that the main kings leave them alone and focus their attention on Israel over here. And then you have Geshem, the Arab, one of Nehemiah's enemies, controls the trade routes vital to Persian interests. So you have the Arabs down here. So you have, again, enemies surrounding Nehemiah and his rebuilding effort to the east, to the north, and to the south. Enemies are always around. Okay, now, so let's look at the verses. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10. So Nehemiah is coming into Jerusalem. He was there. He takes a night tour just to see the condition of the land. He wasn't telling anyone what was in his heart to do. He's just surveying the ruins. But people have heard Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10. Jenny, could you please read that verse for us?
When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant the Ammonite heard of it, they grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel.
Okay, and verse 19 also. Could you read verse 19, Jenny, please?
Sure. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant the Ammonite and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king?
Okay, and so we see them, all three referenced there. We see them again in chapter 4. In chapter 4 and verse 1, who's referenced there? Again, mocking the Jewish people. There it says laughing them to scorn. In chapter 4, it's who's referenced? Sanballat, when they were building the wall. He mocked the Jewish people, and that's a great chapter when Nehemiah stands up, even in verse number 7. Could you read that verse for us, please, Bailey? Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6 and 7.
So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashterites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up, and that the breaches began to be stopped, they were very wroth.
Okay, so again, so as you read this, you can kind of put in your mind again where these enemies are all coming from. So you have Sanballat from the north, you have Tobiah over here to the east, you have the Arabians in the south, and then you have that more Ammonites. Tobiah was an Ammonite leading these other Ammonite peoples against them. And they were mocking them. They were mocking the strength of the wall. They were like saying, man, if even a fox tries to climb over that wall, it'll fall to pieces, it'll break to pieces, And they were mocking them and trying to get them to stop. They were clearly the enemies of Nehemiah. In chapter 6 as well, in verse 1, they're referenced. In chapter 6, verse 1, Jeannie, can you please read that one for us, please? All three are referenced here.
Now it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arabian and the rest of our enemies heard that I had builded the wall, and that there was no breach left therein, though at that time I had not set up the doors upon the gates.
Okay, and go ahead, read the next one, please.
That Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, come, let us meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me mischief.
Yeah, they even tried to get Nehemiah to be so afraid that there were death threats on his life. They said, you better go hide in the temple. And Nehemiah knew that he did not have the right to go in the temple. So they tried to get him afraid to do things like that, and to get him fearful that they needed, that Nehemiah needed them to have the protection that was required to do his rebuilding and reconstruction and everything. And said, let's meet in the plain of Ono, but Nehemiah said, oh no. Okay. This is a great text. I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. I cannot stop the work. That's a great text. I'm doing a great work. And they tried to get him to go in the temple. They said, you better go in the temple. It's the only place where you'll be safe. And Nehemiah said, what are the last 5 words of verse 11? I will not go in. That's really good. And in the midst of all this, so here were these enemies, and Nehemiah knew who the enemies were. But the biggest problem Nehemiah had, I believe, is in verse 18. What's the biggest problem Nehemiah had? The other Jewish people who had an allegiance to these guys, who were trying to literally destroy the work of God, and yet they didn't see them as the enemies. I believe that was the biggest problem Nehemiah had. When you know your enemy, that's good, that's important. But then when other people that you're trying to work with don't know the enemy, that really complicates things. So that caused the biggest problem. There was intermarriage going on between Tobiah and Sanballat and these and the other influential and wealthy people coming back in. There was intermarriage, so there was different allegiances, and so many had an allegiance to Tobiah, and to the point where when Nehemiah had left, and then when he came back years later, guess what he finds in chapter 13, verse 7. Remember, our book says that Nehemiah, he was the governor. Then he took a leave for about 12 years and he came back. So this is after that period. He's come back now. And guess who's living in the temple? Chapter 13, verse 7. And who's got that? Carrie, could you read chapter 13, verse 7?
And I came to Jerusalem and understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God.
Yeah, and so who's hanging out? Who's shacking up there in the temple? Nehemiah is so mad, man. He just literally goes into his room and he opens up the drawer and he starts throwing out his clothes and his socks. Get your stuff out of here. He's like cleaning house. Nehemiah was very upset, and this chapter goes on how he contended. So that's a little bit about these enemies. Now, there's something also in this little section that is very important as you go into the New Testament. And it's on page 170 at the bottom there. Look at that last paragraph where it says the population increasingly consisted of who? I'm on page 170. I'm on the first column. Toward the bottom of the first column, about 4 lines down from the top of that. You see where it says the population increasingly consisted of who? Edomites. Okay, so could you pick that reading up for us, Mondello, right there? And start the population, if you could start there.
All right. The population increasingly consisted of Edomites, dislodged by Arab incursions from their ancestral home southeast of the Dead Sea.
Okay, keep going.
Okay. Idumeans were to play a key role in later biblical history through the powerful Herodian dynasty. The provincial structure of Transjordan was less well known.
Okay, so why do you think that's an important paragraph? King Herod was a descendant of who? The Edomites. And this tells us how the Edomites, who we've always been saying, they live down here, south and east of the Dead Sea. But now, look where they are now. How did they get here? They're in the desert plains of Israel, of Judah. They're in the Negev. This is like, we call this area, remember, the Negev, the south. How did they get there? What did it say? How did they get there?
Sludge,
They were displaced by who?
Arab incursion.
The Arabs. The Arabs had come in and pushed them out of their ancestral homeland and pushed them into Judah, so that when, during in the New Testament in the life of Christ, who's the king? King Herod. And the Herodian dynasty, they were Edomites. So again, think of like in the Old Testament, when the Moabites were the judges, like from Moab, the judge of Moab, or the judge from one of these other areas was ruling in Israel. That's kind of like what's going on in the days of Jesus Christ. But of course, it's not just Herod is the king, but who's ruling over Herod? Rome. And so they curried favor with the Roman Caesars, the Herodians, the Edomites, the Idumeans. Edomites and Idumeans, same, right? So if you go in your book to page 199, because we're going to start thinking a little bit about the New Testament, but if you go to page 199, you could see you see where it says on the second column of page 199, consolidation of power? On the second column, it says, facing a precarious position during his first 10 years, Herod ruthlessly consolidated his power. Herod was an Idumean, an Edomite half-caste. In Jewish eyes, he was unfit to rule. So that kind of flavors the New Testament as we open up the New Testament and see the Herods ruling as the kings. And we'll talk more about this, but there's the map there. And then just real quick, if you go to page 207, you'll see the chart of the different Herodian rulers. And this kind of dovetails with our Acts class. But you'll see the different Herods. And again, I think this is very helpful, because sometimes we're reading in the Gospels and we're like, what Herod is that? Is the same Herod here as there? So this tells you which Herod is who as you read through the Gospels. Like Herod First the Great was the king when Jesus Christ was born. And then Herod Archelaus came in, and then Philip, Herod Antipas, he was later, and then Herod Agrippa the first, and then Herod Agrippa the second. That's who Paul actually makes his case to. So Herod Agrippa the second. So those are the different Herods. They were all descendants of Esau. Okay. So let me give you these blanks and then we'll be done. Go to page 26, please, and go back to and we're on now still page 170. Let's just try to finish this up. So letter B is the province of Yehud, and that's again on page 170, Yehud. This is what Judah was called upon their return. Judah was isolated by mountains, and more people lived more along the coastal areas where the major highways were. So the province of Yehud, and there's a little section about that. And then renewal under Ezra and Nehemiah, that's on page 172. Renewal under Ezra and Nehemiah. Number one, Ezra arrived in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, the king, Ezra 7:7. He was well studied and a prepared, what is Ezra called in Ezra chapter 7, verse 10? He's called a scribe in the word of God. He's called a scribe. So Ezra is definitely, so again, when we get into the New Testament, we see that term scribe. And are they with Jesus? Are they against Jesus? They're against. So Ezra was the first scribe, but clearly by the time of Christ, they had become a corrupted group with their tradition. But Ezra was the first scribe in the law of God. And then Nehemiah, he faced serious opposition, as we've been talking, from Tobiah, Geshem, Sanballat, and he returned to Susa or Shushan after his first 12-year term, and then he went back to Jerusalem for a second term. So that's reference there in your book. He went back for his second term. Ezra and Nehemiah saved the Jewish community from cultural assimilation. Underline that, and that's in your book as well. And where does it say that? Oh, it's on page 172, first column, third, fourth line down. It says the Jewish community was on the verge of cultural assimilation and extinction. God sent two pivotal figures to salvage the situation. So again, God was keeping his people pure and distinct so the Messiah could be born. God used Ezra and Nehemiah in that way. They maintained their identity as the chosen people of God. Some say Ezra was the first scribe. Well, the Bible says that actually, but in the sense of the New Testament scribes, the same group. It doesn't say in the book of Ezra that he started, a group of scribes, but that seems to be what came out of it. And in a sense now, where Ezra was the first scribe, you can almost say how rigid and narrow Nehemiah was. I mean, he would be plucking off his other people's beards. He was rough character, man. It's like, you're not going to follow God. I'm going to pluck your beard, Nehemiah. So some say that Nehemiah was like almost, again, they weren't called Pharisees, and I'm not saying, but I am going to use that term there. He was as the first Pharisee. In the sense, he was very much rigid, narrow, and he wanted his people separate. And that's really what Pharisees were. There's nothing wrong with how, perhaps, I would say how the Pharisees started was how the scribes started. To be separated as the people of God. But then it became very tradition-laden, and they were separating not based on God's word, but based on human tradition. And they became very legalistic.
Like modern Hasidim.
Yeah. Obviously, by the days of Jesus, both these groups had become corrupt. So Nehemiah's Jerusalem. Okay, so I'm getting this little section here. And there's one thing of interest in this. These things are so hard to read, where it says Nehemiah's Jerusalem. You almost have to get your magnifying glass out because it's like, they make it hard to read.
Yeah.
Do you read them?
No, it's just.
Okay. You don't read them?
No,
I'm gonna have to. Let me mark that on my paper here. No,
I was trying to read it before.
Okay, I'm just
I
teasing.
was going,
Okay, so Nehemiah, he arrived 445. He left Susa, which is Shushan, and notice at the bottom. This is what I thought was pretty interesting. The last paragraph. I'll read it since I know it's hard to read. Jerusalem in Nehemiah's day was slightly smaller than the city of David and Solomon, perhaps covering 37 to 38 acres. So that interested me, and I wondered, how big was Jerusalem? Remember when we looked at Hezekiah, how Hezekiah lengthened the wall west, and the city grew to its largest size during the kingdom of Hezekiah. And that was, let's go back, that's on page 145. And so here we see this map is good. Map 73 on page 145. It has the old Jebusite city, which is the city of David, and then his addition to it in yellow above that, you see? And then Solomon's addition, the Temple Mount, when he built the temple, in green. And then Hezekiah's addition with the wall going to the western side, and probably because he provided the water more abundantly into the city so more people could live there. So that was Jerusalem in Hezekiah's day, and that covered, according to this map at the bottom of page 145, how many acres? It's like the second line from the bottom of that. You see that? You see it? How many acres did Hezekiah's Jerusalem cover? 150. Okay, so put that in your notes. That's the last blank. So again, just the comparison. During Nehemiah's time, how big was Jerusalem? 37 acres or so, 37, 38. During Hezekiah, 150. So it was what? Like 1/5 size. And they even had to actually ask people. They had like a lottery almost of people who would live in Jerusalem rather than live out in the countryside, because it was difficult to live there. So that's in the book of Nehemiah as well. Okay, so that's that. So next week we will have our final class, and it will be a review class for the class as well. I might give you just a little bit of the high points of the next chapter or two, because we're not going to cover the next chapter or two because it's kind of intertestamental. So I might just hit at a few of the high points, but basically next week will be a review for our final exam, which I know you can't wait to take.